My name is Sarah. I am 30 years old and I am married to David, who is now 42. We have a son who recently turned 4 years old. But despite all the joy that motherhood brings, I constantly feel like I am between a hammer and anvil when it comes to my family and my sister Carol. She is 33 years old, and there has never been the closeness between us that many people expect from sisters. We are as different as day and night, and our differences have always seemed insurmountable. Growing up, Carol was always the one who defied tradition. She was a rebel who couldn't be controlled. Her parents tried to discipline her, but she always went her own way. I, on the other hand, was always trying to please parents, teachers, friends. I wanted everyone around me to be happy, and I thought that was the essence of family harmony. When I met David, I was only 18 years old. He was a mature, successful, and experienced man who immediately impressed me. I felt I had found in him a reliable partner who could support and protect me in the world. We began dating, and almost immediately, I encountered resentment from Carol. "You're too young, Sarah," she told me when I first shared my feelings for David with her. "He's much older than you are. What do you even know about life and men?" Those words struck me to the core at the time, but I ignored her warnings. Eventually, a few years later, David and I got married, and from that point on, my relationship with my sister began to deteriorate. David, though kind to me, always felt threatened by Carol. He saw her as someone who was not only judging him for our marriage, but trying to influence my opinion of him. He never said it openly, but I could sense it in the little things, in his looks, in his remarks, in his unwillingness to keep in touch with her. In his family, especially his mother Elizabeth, Carol's resentment was even stronger. Elizabeth believed that Carol was undermining the foundations of the marriage and family with her behavior, that she was a threat to stability and peace. Carol, for her part, also had no sympathy for David. She saw him as a man who was dominant and controlling, who sought to bend me to his rules. In her eyes, I was the little girl who needed to be protected from the predator. The situation escalated to a fever pitch at our son's birthday party. We threw a party at our house, inviting all of our family and friends. It should have been a joyous occasion, but right from the start, I could sense the tension. Carol and David hardly spoke to each other, and even simple polite remarks sounded strained and dry. I had a headache and went upstairs to lie down for a while and recover. I closed my eyes and tried to relax, but after a few minutes I heard voices coming from the living room. The argument was so loud that even my headache couldn't drown it out. I got out of bed and walked quietly to the stairs so I could hear better. David was clearly furious, and Elizabeth, his mother, was crying and yelling something back. "She called me a whore," I heard Elizabeth's desperate voice. "She called me ugly and fat in front of everyone. How can you let her say those things?" My heart clenched. I knew this was Carol I was talking about. Those words sounded like a judgment, but I couldn't believe my sister could say such a thing. It wasn't like her. Yes, she was abrasive, but calling a woman a whore, I couldn't believe it. David stormed into our bedroom, all angry. "Did you hear what she said?" he shouted. "Your sister insulted my mother. That's just unacceptable." I tried to calm him down, explaining that Carol would never allow herself to do such a thing, but he was relentless. "Elizabeth heard everything, Sarah. How can you defend her?" I glared at him and said firmly, "Elizabeth is lying. Carol would never say those words." David was shocked at my words. "You're calling my mother a liar? How can you do that, Sarah? You don't even love your sister. Why are you defending her?" Those words pierced me like a knife. David's right. Our relationship with Carol had never been close, but that didn't mean I'd allow her to be slandered. I felt trapped between two worlds, between the family I'd built with David and the bloodline that, despite all the disagreements, was still a part of me. After that argument, David left the house, slamming the door behind him. I heard him on the phone with Elizabeth and his sister Margaret discussing what had happened. There was no one to support me. I was left alone with my thoughts, trying to figure out what had really happened. Later that evening, I decided to call Carol. I didn't know what to expect from the conversation, but I knew I had to get her side of the story. Carol answered me coldly, as usual. There was no trace of anger or resentment in her voice. She told me that during the party she had been helping to assemble the swings in the backyard when Margaret came up to her and told her that Carol was doing man stuff again and should help with the food. I just told her to get the hell out, Carol said calmly. I was tired of being criticized all the time for doing what I thought was right. I took the keys and left. I sat there at a complete loss. This incident was much more complicated than I could have imagined. I knew Carol had always been independent and didn't let anyone tell her how to live her life. But this incident exposed something more crack that had long been running through my family, but which I had stubbornly ignored. The days after the conflict passed in tension. David hardly spoke to me, and Elizabeth and Margaret kept a cold shoulder. I felt isolated, like I was on an island surrounded by a raging ocean. The only thing that kept me afloat was my son. I tried to be a good mom to him, but even that was getting harder and harder. I knew he could feel the tension and anxiety that was eating away at our home from the inside out. One night, when David had long since gone to bed, I sat in the dark in the kitchen, wondering how things had gotten this far. I remembered how I had once admired my sister for her courage and independence, but over the years, our bond had weakened, and I felt more and more like an outsider in her world. And now that my life was built on those traditional values Carol so despised, I found myself in a situation where those values were being put to the test. I realized that if I didn't find a way to reconcile my family, it could be the beginning of the end for my marriage. I couldn't let misunderstandings and underlying resentment destroy what David and I had spent years building. But what to do? How to balance my loyalty to my husband and family with my affection for my sister? How to reconcile two women who could never understand each other? These questions tormented me day and night, giving me no rest. A few days after the quarrel, I decided to meet Carol in person. I invited her to dinner at a cafe where we had once met often as teenagers. She agreed, although her voice on the phone sounded wary. When I arrived at the cafe, Carol was already waiting for me. She looked tired, as if she was also worried about what had happened. We sat down at a table, ordered coffee, and sat in silence for a while, not knowing where to begin our conversation. Finally, I made up my mind. Carol, I don't know how to fix this, I said quietly. I don't want this conflict to destroy our family. She looked at me with obvious surprise, but there was no hostility in her eyes. Sarah, I know you're trying to be good to everyone, she said, slowly choosing her words. But it's impossible. You have to realize that you can't always please everyone. I'm not going to change my views, but I don't want our differences to affect your life. I felt something inside me soften a little. Perhaps this was the first step towards reconciliation, even if not complete, but at least the realization that despite our differences, we could still keep in touch. I just wish you and David could find common ground, I said, trying not to show my true feelings. I know you don't approve of our marriage, but it's important to me that you at least try to understand him. Carol sighed and looked me straight in the eye. Sarah, I don't have to understand him, and he doesn't have to understand me. But I respect your choice. I just don't want you to sacrifice yourself for someone else's expectations. Those words sounded like more than just advice. It was an acknowledgement that despite all her independence, Carol still cared about me, albeit in her own way. I realized that her criticism and dislike of David had always been an expression of her concern for me, even if not always in a form I could accept. When we parted, I felt some relief, but I knew there was still a long road to reconciliation ahead, and it wasn't certain that it would end in success. David was waiting for me at home, and I didn't know how he would react to the fact that I was seeing Carol. But I decided to be honest with him and tell him about our conversation. When I got home, David was sitting in the living room looking through some papers. I sat down next to him and quietly began to tell him about my meeting with my sister. He listened to me without interrupting and then finally spoke. Sarah, I don't want you to be torn between us, but I can't forgive your sister for what she did to my mother. I nodded, understanding his feelings. I know it's hard, but I want you to know that I love you, and I'm trying to do everything I can to save our marriage. David looked at me with a tenderness I hadn't seen in his eyes in a long time. I love you too, Sarah, and I'm willing to try my best for us. Those words gave me hope that, despite the odds, we could get through this crisis, but I knew it wouldn't be easy. A relationship is something that takes constant work and effort, and now that I was between two worlds, my sister's world and my husband's world, I had to find a way to bring them together, or at least make it possible for them to exist side by side without destroying each other. If you like to listen to true and touching stories, be sure to subscribe to my channel. Every day I publish new audio stories about real events and people. Recommend our channel to your friends so they can enjoy unique stories too.